Fantastic. So thank you for joining us today for this wonderful opportunity to talk with Roy Childs himself. Now, working in 10 years in psychometrics, Roy has been very much a part of my career, not to be narcissistic or anything, but everybody I talk to talks about Roy in the highest esteem that he had gathered literally over decades working in this field, and his in-depth knowledge, but also slightly playful nature when it comes to different constructs and how he puts them to work. So that's enough about from my perspective, Roy, and that's the rating. And now it comes back to the self-report. Roy, how would you describe yourself?
It's an interesting one. You get straight to the core of something that's really important there, which is our own sense of identity, which I treat as a core concept, in fact. And when people start having the debates around personality, motivations, etc., you know, at the core of all of that is our sense of identity. So how would I describe myself? I'd rather not, to be honest. I mean, I think there's you go too far, too way along there. I know that in my professional life, a psychologist, yes, and with a specialism in psychometrics. And to be honest, Nikita, that is not where I thought I would be. Mm-hmm. You know, when I went to university, I actually chose psychology because I read Anthony Storr's book on aggression. Mm-hmm. And that sort of switched me from sort of science to psychology, which is a science, but it's actually much broader than that. And you know, I just thought I wanted to understand, because I saw violence around me. I mean, I was, you know, went to school on a working class estate and what have you, and we used to have things thrown at us because we had grammar school uniforms on, etc. So I went to Exeter and was hugely disappointed with the course at first. Met Paul Klein, who became the first professor of psychometrics in the country, and he was one of the more interesting lecturers. And although he is known for the psychometrics, he's a much broader thinker. And that's where I think, you know, I like to position myself, that I'm not stuck with the psychometric label. I mean, Paul Klein wrote the Fact and Fantasy and Freudian Theory, for example, which is fascinating to think about. What do you do with all that stuff? So he was much more than a numbers man. But interestingly, leaving university, debating whether to do a PhD then or not, and deciding to go on sort of an occupational wandering, you know, as a van driver and a bit of teaching, etc., and then getting a job at NFER with Peter Saville. And that obviously has had a significant effect. But instead of, when Peter left to form SHL, which he invited me to join a few times, I went into research, to the Research Foundation, and my research project was to develop a range of tests that could be used in schools to help teachers understand their kids. And it was in the period when the 11 plus was fading away, and there was still a need to understand the cognitive functioning of children in schools. So I ran the Differentiated Ability Scales project, and after that, I was offered a full-time research post, which was one of the biggest decisions of my life, which was to turn it down. And I then went off, set up a company, worked in across Europe, did some teaching psychology. And as a freelance psychologist, Peter Saville was inviting me to do work, and I did that as an associate. ASC and NFER were inviting me, Poe and Condola were. So in the end, I said, you know, I'm getting lots of offers of work and it's more varied. I think I'll stay freelance, which lasted 10 years, by which time I could feel myself getting stuck in that. And that's when I set up Team Focus. And we really made our name by doing sort of consultancy work, but training people in psychometrics. And we had a very strong theme that we were training people to understand psychometrics, not to sell them psychometrics. And I think that's always been an issue for the publishers, is a need to sell their instruments. So we did that for 10 years. And I realized, and I still am, highly critical of the psychometric approach. I will say more later, Nikita, on the value of it, because it is hugely valuable. But the way it is understood and used, there are so many things wrong with it. And it's very easy to be negative. It's very easy to say, that's not good enough, etc. So when in 1999, we were invited to put in for some money from the European Social Fund to then offer some psychometric experiences to a whole host of people. It was like a gift, but a challenge, turning the sort of the critique into what would you put in its place? And that was the birth of the Profiling for Success range of tests and questionnaires, because nearly all of those are ones which they do not simply ape what is already there. I mean, what I find in today's world is there's more and more of the same. Yet another questionnaire, yet another big five, you know, and the differences between them are not very imaginative. And I will say a little bit more about another talk I gave, which was from Shakespeare to Gogglebox, which is whether we are actually going from quality to something much less in psychometrics, which I think there has been a backsliding in that, in spite of all the innovations and technology that helps us. So yes, the European Social Fund funding gave us money and samples to develop very quickly some alternatives. And that's what we did. And so I suppose now I'm in a position where I am involved in using psychometrics, but with a slightly different slant from the way in which I see the mainstream.
Fantastic, Roy. It's a nice 10-minute summary of over what 30, 40 years in the career. I'm just curious that you mentioned that it's quite different to how other people might be using them. How would you define like key points of difference in your approach to psychometric and in the way you use them?
I think that, okay, the short answer is there's not enough psycho and there's too much metric. I think psychology has been sidelined, and what we do is focus so much on the numbers and the stats and the support and increasing the sophistication of the stats, etc., built on inadequate foundations of psychological thinking. And I'll give you some examples of that if you like. But before I do that, I'd like to say how this thinking has evolved, because I was very fortunate when I was freelance that somehow I met Ray Cattell, and he invited me. It was in fact just as I was setting up Team Focus, and he wanted to come back to the UK because he said people don't understand psychometrics, and he wanted to tell his story because he has been criticized for what he's done. I mean, Paul Klein was a great exponent of Cattell, but in the end said, but he didn't achieve what he set out to achieve. Well, that may be true. But in meeting Ray, I mean, first of all, as a psychologist, you study these great names. There is no substitute for actually meeting the originators, because all the great names become parodies. They become sound bites of certain things. And Ray was much more thoughtful and considered than a man who did factor analysis to discover personality. And one of the things that happen when you meet people is you get the asides. I mean, one amazing aside, which the whole psychological community ought to think more about, because I got sucked into this. If you remember, Nikita, the Bert controversy. Bert was a fraud. He fabricated his data, and that data was used to set up the tripartite system in education, etc., etc. And meeting Ray, he said Bert was a man of fantastic integrity. He knew him. He said the reason that it looks like he fiddled his data was, yes, London University was bombed in the war and he lost some of it. So he did recreate it, and therefore it looks a little bit clean. But there's a lot of other data. And when people say, and there's no record of his supposed co-workers who were Jane Conway and Margaret Howard, no record of them ever having studied. He made them up. That's the story that's been handed down. And Ray said to me that I met them. I knew them. I know they existed. And yet these things get now put over as fact. And it's interesting because in a way I was ready to be sucked into the Bert story of fraud because I wasn't in favor of the way in which we were dividing children at the age of 11 and putting them into different things, which felt a bit unfair. But that is not a reason then to ignore the facts that are there. And, you know, maybe Cattell was wrong, I don't know. But the fact he told me, looked me in the eye and said, look, they are pillaging him, putting him in the stocks for things that aren't true is grossly unfair. But the reason I put Ray as a significant influence is because his approach is highly statistical, as is the whole of psychometrics. And in fact, Ray was the person that was asked to suggest the curriculum for the level A, level B training that was done. And he made it heavily statistical. Now, that's been watered down a lot since then, but it still has got a lot of stuff in there, and the training issue is another one. But if you are going to use statistics and factor analysis, Ray was very clear that what you put in will define what you get out. And so, you know, his whole concept of how you decide what you put in, he used the dictionary, the idea of the personality sphere, the idea of how you make sure that you map the whole domain. You don't just say, oh, I want persuasiveness, oh, I'll have that, etc. You don't go shopping, you know. You need some rigor. And to be honest, if you're going to do a factor analytic approach, you need the kind of rigor that he was proposing. And I do not see that being done with competency libraries, the OPQ. You know, I mean, Peter's not around to defend himself anymore, but the idea that you ask managers, what do you want? And they say persuasiveness and decisiveness, then you give them what the punters want, which is a literal quote from Peter, to give you the OPQ is not what I call finding out about personality. And Ray made that clear to me. So he was a significant influence, and the Ray Peter thing as well was a significant influence, because I remember I was asked to read Peter's PhD before he submitted it and comment on it, etc. And in that discussion, I remember him saying, oh, it's ridiculous, he said. Look, factor G and factor Q3, they correlate so highly together. They should just be merged. And that is a warning signal. The correlational approach leads you to merge things because they correlate, not because they are psychologically the same. And as a little explanation of that, there is a huge difference between the concept between factor G, which is about what Cattell called the superego, but it leads to needing to do what's right and knowing what, so it's social rightness, which includes structure and order and doing things and following the rules. And Q3, which correlates highly, is not about that. It's about identity. How much do I know, understand, and clarity around my own identity? And of course they correlate, but one has a more external focus and one has a more internal focus. And psychologically, they're so different. So, realizing that correlations do not discover. They are something that you apply to your discovery to try and understand it better. And that's where I think the cart has gone in front of the horse in psychometrics. The stats and the numbers are the things now which drive it, and we leave behind our understanding of what it is that we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think to me is the way I phrase it. It's a difference between psychometric publishers and personality science. Because you have the science as a discipline with the research, academia, etc., which kind of keeps going on. Now people think big 5 is a way to go, but maybe it will be big 6 in a couple of years' time, or big 3, because that's the benefit of science. We're figuring it out as best as we can as we go along. And then you have psychometric publishers, which some started in 40s and 50s. And some of them keep their tools more up to date than others. And there's always that tension. And as far as the correlations and statistics, yeah, very much agree with you. It's more about psychometric publishing. It's right now what really kind of got me going is whenever I see an ad on LinkedIn saying, use a psychometric and remove bias. I mean, it's just like, I just think, oh, psychometric doesn't mean what it thinks it means. And when you get to them, it's like, how do you remove bias? Oh, we put it on an app. Okay, how does this remove bias? Does it add extra bias? What reasonable adjustments can you make? Did you create this app with neurodiverse candidates in your norm group? And you know what response I get usually? Nothing. Silence, which is, yeah. And at the same time, there's some sort of disconnect that quite a few people working in those companies think they're at the forefront of knowledge of psychology, and then say, we have something really innovative. And I said, well, don't you remember they tried this 20, 30 years ago? And they're like, what? And sometimes this innovation is not so much innovation, but lack of knowledge of history.
Well, I do get upset by the continual clarion call, rigorously developed and fully validated, and they can't say those things. They are overused. When I look at what they mean by rigor, I mean, Nikita, I think I'm the only person in the UK that runs a specialist and test use training. And in that, we have to look at, the manuals, the, technical guides, etc. And always it's a challenge to look at the rigor. Where is the rigor? Where does it detail really how this whole thing came to pass, how the items were developed, how they were then tried? I mean, there are so many things in there, that the standard things that you'd expect, and they are poorly documented. But you see, the other thing, and it wasn't just sort of Ray and Peter and that thing that was the light bulb, if you like. It was then working with Will Schutz. And Will Schutz was such a different psychologist, and so there I was sort of trying to sort of understand how Thyro is different. And I met Will in 1990 and I trained with him. There's actually an interview on my YouTube channel that I did with him at the time. So I look a lot younger there, by the way, ginger beard and the whole works. And then I ran some workshops with him. And it's such a different approach to it, because what you're doing is you are getting people to reflect on who they are, how they react, what happens, and challenging their own view of themselves. And in that process, light bulbs come on. You're building self-awareness. And then you think about how the traditional psychometric personality questionnaire says, tell us what you think about yourself. Reflect, what's typical about you, and you do it. So you go through a Schutz workshop, and you get more, oh, but a good questionnaire will mean you're just the same before as you were after. Well, you don't change personality, that's unchangeable. Well, whether we can change personality or not, I don't think that's the point. The point is that we are only dealing with people's belief about themselves through self-report questionnaires. That is, so we are dealing with people's narrative about themselves, not their DNA. And yet we treat them as if it's DNA. And in fact, Costa and McRae believe they have got at the DNA. They believe that the big five is an inherent thing. And through our self-belief thing, we get at it. Well, if there is DNA there that leads to that, I don't want to argue that point because it's quite possible. That's not the material we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's the power of self-narrative. And I mean, with Costa and McRae, I can sort of get this, you know, they created NEO to look at changes of personality across adulthood. So they're dealing with really large samples, looking for changes across large data sets. So any individual variance would be discarded as measurement error. And I thought it's only in the last 10, 15 years since the publication of Judge article, what is it? Who I am today is not who I was yesterday and not who I'll be tomorrow. Some nice trippy title by Judge. And to actually see personality as a dynamic entity, just to look at the dynamics. And then we kind of, I remember reading one article that said, it's not necessarily measurement error. Those changes are actually quite meaningful to the person. And I think that thing, it's if people can start looking at their personality, and whenever I do a workshop or a session, my aim is simples. If they can be a couple of percent more curious about themselves than others and a couple of percent less judgmental, I think it's a good use of a couple of hours of your time.
Yeah. Well, as we know, the psychometric model is based on consistency and stability.
Yeah.
And so once you say, is that really what personality is? Or is personality more dynamic than that? And this is where I get quite upset that people, and the third big influence of me was Jung, reading Jung. I mean, people who criticize Jung, first of all, go and pick up psychological types. You read that and you will understand that Jung is trying to understand the human condition. I do not get that feeling from the manuals and the writings of most of the psychometricians. They're not trying to understand the human condition. They're trying to summarize it, capture it, rigidify it, make it simple. Jung was not doing that. But what people don't understand, because psychological type sounds type fixed, is that his concept of type is dynamic. And it's moving,
yes,
and it's balancing, and it's all of these things.
Absolutely. It's even in the book. Like, I mean, to me, it's his quote, you know, it's like a tiger has two paws, like introversion, extroversion. And it just has a dominant one. It doesn't mean it can't use the other one. It's just more likely to strike from the dominant one. And I think the key thing is it just gets passed down, passed down, passed down, passed down. And it's like a xerocopy of a xerocopy of a xerocopy. And to me, I always remember Wendy's joke, and I'm not sure how much it was a joke, but it was an HR manager, and the consultant is trying to sell them a type-based tool. And the consultant goes, Jungian this, Jungian that, Jungian this. And then any questions? And the HR person goes, no, all is very clear, but I have one question. And the consultant goes, what is it? He goes, who's this young Ian you keep talking about?
Yeah.
Have to do much with Jung sometimes.
Well, look, I mean, the thing about how Jung's model is about the continual balancing and rebalancing of things, and in the end, transcending them, you know. And so, you know, there is an evolution in the way in which we not only understand our personality, but we develop it. And developing it means developing the other side. I mean, I often use the example of optimism and pessimism. You know, I mean, everybody's got elements of both, you know, and the over-optimistic needs to warn, you know, be wary of just being too naive, and the overly pessimistic of never seeing the opportunities. You know, there's a positive and a negative around all of these. So instead of thinking about averaging everything to a point on a scale, thinking of things as to how do we balance and integrate, and what triggers that. I mean, I like the idea of a mosaic of personality rather than a set of traits, where in different contexts, different elements come to the fore. And most people understand that. You're a different person with your kids or your, offspring than you are with maybe, well, your wife or your people at work or whatever. I mean, different parts of you are triggered by different situations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just so happy that APA recently updated the definition of personality. I'm just checking it out. Personality refers to enduring characteristics and behaviors that compromise a person's unique adjustment to life, including major traits, interests, drives, values, self-concepts, abilities, and emotional patterns. Because, for example, before there was nothing about context, such as adjustment to life. It seemed to have existed in this artificial vacuum.
Yeah.
But we all change personalities, and I would just go back to, but I don't think we have a healthy relationship with personality growth, because, for example, to me, even going back to the word persona, the masks the ancient Greeks used, the original emojis, but ancient Egyptians might disagree. But the key thing is it's through what the air goes through. And the concept of acting, of us playing different roles with different people and having this variety. But when people try to do something, we often call it, fake it till you make it. And to me, it just sends a cold shiver down my spine when people say that. Why not, play it till you make it, develop, try this role on, see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, you see, I mean, this is where I actually think that when we talk about rigor in psychometrics, there's a lack of rigor. I mean, the concept of a work personality, that is immediately saying in that role, what do you do? Hold on, isn't that role not personality then? Can we play? Yes, we do play different roles. And this leads to another fundamental thing, which is that, behavior is one thing, but is that personality? And the behavioral tradition would argue, well, it's, personality can't be anything else. But then behavior in a context, and some people have contexts where they are not able to express many potential behaviors. So how can you summarize people by what they do, as opposed to what feels more like them? You want to say something, I can see that.
Yeah, it's just, to me, it's also really kind of shocking. It's like when you have clients who try to be a little bit, provocative, and you sit down with them and they go, well, I completed many of this, but can you tell me this? Is this my home self or my work self?
Yeah.
And now I just ask, how are the two different? That's far more interesting.
Yeah.
How are you managing the two? And this concept of authenticity, I feel that sometimes our field has like really interesting mutations with more popular psychology, like growth mindset or authenticity. Everything you do is authentically you. To what's account it's aligned to what you like, what you don't like, that's a different story.
Yeah. So, I mean, this idea, I mean, if you read Psychology's Ghost, Jerome Kagan, the first chapter is missing context, and he's lambasting actually psychology as a whole for ignoring context. Psychometrics has hugely, at work or at home, well, some kind of typical you, etc. You're asked to average it all. No. So, I mean, I actually argue that role questionnaires like Belbin are not role questionnaires because they are asking you to give some kind of generalized view. They're not about inner context. There's some generalized concept of inner team. That is a sort of context, but it's very general. Because if I work in one team and another team, what I do in each could be very different because the needs are different. So Belbin, I say, it's just sort of kind of a team personality. An OPQ, which says work personality, is actually a role questionnaire. The rigor, we've got the language all mixed up, and it's because we haven't sorted out behavior, preferences, motivation, attitude. I went through the NEO, and it's got items of all of those. And how is it justified? Because they correlate. So the correlational lens, which is a hugely interesting tool, has become the driving force, which is why you get what Cattell said, bloated specifics, loads of things that, items which again was a fundamental part of the OPQ. things that, so you end up with bloated specifics. And we needn't go into that one here because this isn't the right place for that debate, but it's hugely disappointing. And that's why I feel that in a way, the OPQ development was moving towards greater simplicity. Make it simple, which was actually a driving force for Peter. He said to me, you know, we've got to get rid of all that mumbo jumbo, just give the punters what they want, etc. Well, yes, but that has made things too simple. And the flight to superficiality is a shame. The big questions that we used to ask, what is personality? How many factors? What should they be? You know, what underpins them? The difference between source traits and surface traits. I don't see that question being asked anymore, you know, and we're not there. The big five is like a blanket now that says, oh, we got it. We know what it is. No need to do any more thinking. Yeah. And that's the trouble.
And let's say IPIP is a little bit too close to Neo for comfort for my liking. So now most of the research that is being done is using IPIP. And therefore, it's not actually exploring or pushing the boundaries of the known. It's more like a comfort blanket, you know. And I love Big Five, don't get me wrong, but to what extent what we're not measuring is just as interesting as what we do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so, I mean, one of my biggest questions is we should stop using the word rigor unless we define it, you know, because otherwise it's rigor mortis. Okay.
Nicely put.
But my criticisms are then that we use language which is not appropriate, that the psychometrics are oversold. They are sold as if they were physical measurement, and they are not physical measurement. I give you a really illuminating example, which was, I mean, you may have heard me talk about this before, Nikita, but the one about how when NASA had a problem with openness. You know, some of the errors at NASA were known in advance, but people weren't brave enough to articulate them, and things went badly wrong. Okay, so they asked Wilshire to run all these workshops on openness. And being the scientist that he was, the before and after, he asked them, they did a survey, how open are you? And people said, oh, pretty open, you know, but we'll go through the workshops and we'll get more open. So, you know, they come out one level, and after a year of workshops, the follow-up survey, how open are you now? Down.
Nice.
And asking those people, what's gone wrong? They says, nothing's gone wrong. We now realize that openness is not what we thought it was. And where we thought we were before was not really where we were. So they had changed their ideas about it. They had changed the benchmark. Now, all self-report suffers from the same thing. Different ideas of what they are and different benchmarks which can change. So we cannot treat the numbers as hard numbers.
No.
And yes, that is how they often are presented. So we cannot sell it as metric in that sense. And then there's issues with the validation model that we have and the reliability models that we have. Reliability is about consistency, whereas what we really want is accuracy, which will mean that things change if an instrument is sensitive enough. And validation is really much more than just taking one score at one point in time and another score from somewhere else. It's like, you know, we don't have rifles that are not moving in the rifle range in a target. Both are moving. My view of myself is moving. So you cannot apply such a simplistic model. So oversimplification will probably be my biggest thing, because there is still a lot of value in what psychometrics has achieved. You know, everybody who uses these does come out and say, well, that was useful. You know, you do the NEO, you do the MBTI, you do any of these, and it shines something back. But if you shine it back at them and say, this seems to be what you're saying, but you might not have realized you're saying it because it's structured in a way, because we live our life in the chaos of our thinking. The
Yeah.
psychometrics structure it and say, do you realize some of the things you seem to be saying here? Oh, yeah. So self-report can produce insight. It's not just giving you back what I knew already. So that's really it. Oversold and oversimplified. And we need to update, extend, or change the way we use the psychometric model, because it's not fit for the complexity of the subject matter that we've got. It's too simple, and therefore it will simplify it.
Yeah, it's for me, a good psychometric is a tool of self-expression rather than putting you in a box. And then you need to have more options how you can turn out in human population so it can capture the individuality. I always say, if there's only really 12 or 16 types of us, humanity would have died out a long time ago, because there's diversity of personality, diversity of perspectives. It's what's really magical about our species. There is some good sides to it, despite watching the news. Humans are pretty remarkable in more ways than one. And to me, what you mentioned, Roy, is so key. You mentioned that it's what was useful to the person. And I think we do have test retest validity, we have criterion validity, we have all of those. But to me, the only point it touches a client, we talk about face validity. But from this perspective, it's like, does it look legit for them in order to put in the data? But I always want to go a step further than this. I have a theory called utilitarian validity. So what was actually useful to you as a client from completing this assessment? Did it help you to get a job that's more aligned with your aspirations and how you want to develop, etc.? Or did you have some insight into your relationships and how you perceive yourself? Like, was this beneficial? But the way psychometrics are used, if it's in selection, you'd be lucky to get any feedback, even a copy of your report. Then for development, also quite lucky to get any kind of coaching or development based on it. And therefore, it's just like we got so focused on validity, reliability, that we're actually losing touch with what's actually useful to the individuals completing these assessments.
Yeah. Well, I remember Will Schutz saying to me, he said, Roy, sometimes I can get as much value from tea leaves. Why? Because it's not the scores, it's the reaction to the scores. And that's what it is. The fact that, and I say, well, in the end, I could do that with tea leaves too. But I think it's better to start with something that's got a bit more foundation to it, that you recognize. But it is then, I mean, when I've used the FIRO and people, you look at it and there can be some big differences between the is and the want, which is another question here that we haven't covered yet. But between the is and the want, and you think, oh, that's going to be interesting. And, your client, your coachee looks at it and says, yeah, I know that. Yeah, I know that. I've been working on that. But that one there, well, I don't see. And it's something that, in the scores you'd think is trivial, but it means something to them. And unpacking what it means to them is a fantastic thing. So you're driven by the reaction, not by the scores themselves.
Yeah, it took me, I'm, a bit embarrassed to say, years to realize this, because when clients disagreed with the reports, I used to say, well, test, retest, reliability, and all of this. And now I'm just like, well, how would you describe yourself? And they go, Nikita, I'm really not tough. Can you understand that? I'm really not tough. And you go, okay, these reports are nonsense, and I'm really not that. And it's like, well, if it's such nonsense, why are you having such a strong emotional reaction to it? Fascinating.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know if I probably haven't shared with you the ACDC feedback model that I use. But the ACDC is that with any form of feedback, you need something which people can latch onto. So I call it affirmation. Oh, yeah, I see. So the questionnaire, yeah, I can see, maybe I am like that. Maybe I am like that. And but then you've got the C, which is where people look at what they're getting in the feedback. And that C is, well, that's an interesting way to put it. C stands for communication. I haven't thought, yes, I am. That's it. And I've done this with kids, often adolescent boys who can't articulate themselves. And so that's what I meant, So the report can help them to communicate their self-belief about themselves better. But we then get to the AC-DC, and the D reaction is discovery, where they're looking at their report and they're saying, oh, I hadn't thought of, am I really? Maybe I am. I need to think about that. So they're discovering things that the questionnaire throws up. And, you know, the thing is then, and the AC-DC, the C at the end is challenge, where the person is saying, well, that's not right, you know. And to me, that is often the gold dust. That is often the bit in the whole process that has the greatest impact or illumination or value, because it's potentially the bit that they're blind to, that we are all blind. We're dealing with self-report, you know, we are blind. We need to be able to get behind to move self-awareness on. So the C there of challenge, and I use the 1% rule, which is, so you don't agree with that. I wonder why it's come up like that then. You look at it, I mean, either the questionnaire is rubbish, which is possible, but I've chosen it because I've used it a lot. Let's think of it as being right for a moment. In what way can you think of any time in your life where it could have been true, or anywhere? And people will often go, well, maybe when I was at school or whatever. And then it slowly emerges that shyness which they've got over is still there, or that, you know. So you're helping people to recognize, and that can be the most useful part. And you're right, Nikita, about, you know, I forget what you called it, but, you know, the validity of the impact on the individual is really important, you know, but it's not in the metrics that we've got. You know, I think some people call it experiential validity or whatever. But we've got to remember, if we are trying to predict behavior from a moving self-concept now to a moving place there, that's maybe not the point. If what we're saying is that we are helping people to understand their own identity, and two, as I see it, we are basically using questionnaires to capture their autobiographical narrative. And that narrative is an evolving narrative, because we don't want to be stuck on the same page of the same book forever. You know, we are evolving, and we're helping people to write the next chapter of their life. And we're giving agency to them, to taking charge and using this stuff and saying, yeah, I see that. And maybe I am there, maybe I have been, but where am I going? And so it looks forward rather than backwards. And much of psychometrics and quite a bit of psychology is about looking backwards. This is why I am who I am today, because of my childhood, because of this, because etc., as opposed to this is where I am now, but this is where I'm going. How do I get there? Which is a much more experientially useful model generally.
Absolutely, and also acknowledging the value of context, because quite often people are obsessed with the dark triad or the dark side, which I think is quite funny, to be able to make that judgment based on some self-report questions without knowing the context. But that's another thing, rather than actually acknowledge that, okay, even if these behaviors are maladaptive in this current context, at some point in this person's life, they were adaptive. That's why they're there. They didn't pop up just because they just felt like it. It's been adaptive in a particular environment and particular circumstances. So we can explore actually what has changed in the circumstances that now make it less than desirable, let's say this way, and what can be done in the future.
Yeah. But you see, one of the things about helping people sort of think of their life going forward. So how am I mean, it's a question that all of us have, especially when you reach middle age, wherever that is, you know, is that it? Is that all I've done? Or what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And this is why, I mean, what we did with the type mapping system and the TDI is we introduced the idea of, you know, my preference is the way it is, and the preference is the way I want, taken from Firo. And what I want is such an important part of my psyche, everybody's psyche. But it is also about then looking at that gap and thinking, if I'm not where I want, how do I get there? So it turns the lens, and it also then automatically gets people into thinking of themselves as more dynamic and as changing and evolving, and as having some choice in all of that. So it embodies a lot of concepts, which certainly in the learning and development space is much more useful than the rigidity of, well, this is it. And test retest means you're unlikely to change. I mean, how many people come to me and say, I'm told that by the age of about 20, you can't change it anymore. Well, I don't know. I think there's a lot that can be changed. And experientially, I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago. There's a lot there. It's a bit like saying that block of marble out of which Michelangelo made the David. It took a lot of chipping away to do that. Well, life chips away at us and we become something new, and sometimes worse and sometimes better.
Oh, depends who you ask. But is it better
Yes.
or but the key thing here is that it is that I came across a term that only last year called personality growth, and that was really interesting. It was from a study of teenagers, and one cohort was told they can change their personality, and the other cohort wasn't told this. And the cohort that was told they can change their personality, like their neuroticism went down, I think agreeableness might have went up in a year's time. So even thinking you can change and work on yourself is already quite liberating in itself.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you remember, I mean, my undergraduate Schachter and Singer's study where they gave people, I think it was epinephrine, adrenaline
Oh yeah.
injection. We used to be able to do that in those days, but half of them were told this is going to make you excited, and the other half were told this is going to make you fearful. What was the result? Some got scared, and the others became excited and stimulated. The same drug, experienced or interpreted differently. So yes, I mean, when you think about that, you see, this is what I'm saying, oversimplification in what we've been doing is a shame. We need to recognize this and recognize, as I say, the way in which people can have much more agency over who they are and who they become.
Absolutely. And talking about becoming, I wasn't familiar with Fire-B scale, and I'm just curious that because you met Schultz and Cattell, from your experience, why do they think they founded those, created those instruments? Was it true that Schultz created Fire because of submarines?
I think cause and effect is a difficult model here. I don't think it was because of submarines. There is a more direct cause here, which is that he was invited, he had to go back into the Navy during the Korean War. And he said, do you want to use my head for target practice for the enemy or for something more useful? And they said, well, what could you do? And he said, I could. And they said, we've got a big problem with the way in which our ship's crews don't get on. Study it. And that's where the FIRO came about, from studying the dysfunction of ship's crews and then thinking, what is it? And he distilled it all down to those three elements. And it's, the title of his book, Profound Simplicity, is, when I say oversimplification, I love simplicity. Bertrand Russell was fantastic at making philosophy simple. Einstein said we should simplify everything as far as we can, but no further. And what we've done is we've gone too far. So simplicity is good, but not oversimple. And what Schutz did, Schutz, not Schultz, by the way, what Schutz did with FIRO was to distill things at a much deeper level. If you like, we could say that certainly modern personality questionnaires, which are just like, the earth around us, hundreds and thousands of compounds, hundreds of competencies and different things that we could have. But underneath it is the molecular structure, trying to get at that. And Cattell, that was his dream, and he hoped to get there, probably didn't, but he was trying to get there. Schutz, even deeper. What are the fundamental things that are triggered when we're in interpersonal situations? And he distilled it down to that. And it's interesting how he got there, because it was a rational process. It was a review of the literature and coming down. These things keep coming back, but developing Firo, and it took him 10 years to realize that what he developed in this flush of research and producing Firo B was actually quite good, but he then improved it with Firo elements. And he actually wanted Firo B to be taken off the market, but CPP wouldn't do it because they had a good market for it. So he took his one back and actually gave us the distribution rights in 1996. So I got quite sort of close to Will and for a while. But anyway, I was very impressed with the way in which each of his concepts he understands in a multifaceted way. He said, I dreamt these things up, 10, 20 years ago. It's taken all that time for me to connect between the head and the heart as to what these really mean. Inclusion, control, openness, as he now calls it, instead of affection. He said, really understanding those has taken that long. And you won't understand it until you have really rummaged around into their deep meaning of that, which is why so many experiential exercises that challenge you to say, is that really true, Roy? What does that feel like? And you start understanding yourself better. And that's a good use of psychometrics, for goodness sake, not, that published research which says that, well, me saying I'm persuasive and it correlates with that assessment center, where I've got a few people saying he shouted the loudest. I think that's what persuasiveness is, or however we define it. It's wanting to understand rather than simply having a model and publishing a product.
Exactly. So simplification should be done to make it more usable, but it shouldn't be done in order to reduce the experience and understanding of the human personality.
What a nice way to put it, Nikita.
Thank you, Roy. And it is Schutz, was it?
Schutz, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, it's fascinating. I didn't know about the story about Korean War, and yeah, talking about agency. And Roy, anything else to add on this whirlwind of psychometric personality history and cool stuff that you're doing currently at Team Focus?
Well, yeah, we are doing some different things. As I said to you, helping people to articulate where I think I am. And I think this separation of preference, the inner me, but then role and context, because so often personality questionnaires reflect the role, so helping people to do that. So we do that with type mapping. People do the role questionnaire, the MTRI. When they've done that, you've lanced the boil. Do you mean at work or at home? Now, all these things you do, who's the person behind that? Now do the TDI, okay, and do it as the person inside that, if it didn't have contextual constraints, would feel most natural. Mm-hmm. But then also asking them, but is that the person that you really want to be? And in that, you address an important, essential psychological construct of the ideal self. What is this thing? And what we found with the TDI is want is that people's idea of their ideal self is also open to change when they face it. They think they, and that, in fact, it's not their ideal self, it's their parents' ideal self or something. And shifting that is hugely helpful for them. So just the TDI is want, which is a bit like the Myers-Briggs, but significant differences. 75%, 72% of the population report a difference in their type. I mean, that's huge. How can you therefore, this is why I say MBTI, some things are good, like it's asking preference rather than behavior and role, but the fact that it is, not looking at preference being a comfort zone as opposed to being an aspiration or, a current circumstance or an outdated stereotype, instead of those, we need to bring those out so that people can really ask themselves the question. So that's one thing, Nikita. You said, what else are we doing? Another one, which has been dropped. Neo was one of the first to do this, where in the paper versions, they had, you do it, but they get someone to do it about you. Well, we do that with TDI. We do that with the values questionnaire, the VBIM. Everybody comes out with motherhood and apple pie when you ask them about values. You get people to complete, and I think VBIM is one of our most complex psychometric instruments, but you get people to articulate their values, but you can then, one, challenge them because of the consistency of the way in which they say those things, but also you can challenge them with a paired other, saying this is how you come across to me. And the paired versions get you beyond self-report. It's now and it's not just that it's saying, well, that's how you come across to them. I mean, we use 360 for that as well, although the paired version is more powerful than that. But it changes the person's engagement with it. Because if I knew you were going to do the questionnaire that I'm doing, but about me, I'd be saying, oh, that's what I always, is it? Nikita's going to be answering this. Am I really? Could I honestly? No. And it makes people much more thoughtful about it, which comes back to that, again, that trivial, stupid way in which all the psychometrics say, give the first answer that comes to you. No, give the answer that is most true of you now. And some of that will need reflection. Otherwise, you'll just give what you always say, which may be outdated.
And even the time it takes per item. I was just chatting with a colleague, and when he once got a Neo that was completely average, he went to Wendy and it's like, what the hell? What am I going to say to them? She said, download the items and look at the times it took per each answer. And then the items which took the most time, answer them. What went through their, ask them what went through their head when they were completing it.
Yeah.
Even that's quite interesting. Rather than this reductionist, is it work? Is it home self? Are you like different people? It's all you.
Well, look, I think that the problem for psychometrics is it has come at it from a selection, I do it unto you lens. And in selection, they're going to play a game, give the first answer, don't give them a chance to think, etc.
Hit them fast, hit them hard. They're going to lie anyway. And I'm just like, Jesus Christ, that's your default setting? You think all your applicants are going to lie? What sort of what would Roger say about unconditional positive regard there?
And that's where the validation model comes in, etc. When we're saying, look, if we change that lens and say, look, questionnaires are another form of interview. They're a way of giving people an opportunity to express themselves, but in a new way that they might not have thought of, but is very quick and efficient. And then that is the basis for whatever we do after that, for discussion, certainly. No personality questionnaire should be used as a screening device. I mean, I've actually done validation studies where, we have demonstrated, yes, there's a correlation between sales and more extrovert and a bit more conscientious, etc. But when I mean, this is a sample of 122 people, I said, give me your 3 best. None of them were the stable extroverts that the generality said. And if you want excellence, you need to look for outliers. And yet statistics actually does the opposite. It washes out outliers.
Plus, there's diversity. I always feel there's ecosystems of personalities within teams and organizations. And my 2 bugbears, of course, psychometrics love salespeople because it's KPI. And I'm like, is it really people who made the most sales or people who took the most credit? For the sales of others. And plus, the key thing, which really is kind of troubling, it's based on performance in the past. So if you base the performance based on the past, you completely kind of, maybe, yes, those extroverts higher in conscientiousness perform better when they're surrounded by more introverted, less conscientious, highly agreeable people. We don't know this. But then if you start moving the arrow in that way of personality, and you have less diversity of thought, less personality, it's all based on performance of the past, you're not really lining yourself up to be in a great place in 5 to 10 years time.
Yeah. And that leads on to something else, which is the way in which increasingly we are going to AI systems for doing all of this.
Oh yeah.
And, first of all, much of that is historical anyway. So there are biases there. It's not about what you could do, which is what we really would like. And in a changing world, that's more and more important. So the old adage, past behavior is the best prediction of future. Well, there's still some truth in that, but it's less and less true. And we do want, what could people do if they were liberated, if they were fired up in the right way, understood in the right way? But there's the ethical thing about how we collect that data without people's knowledge or agreement.
Oh, Jesus Christ, especially as a NLP, the language processing. I mean, to me, what's really shocking, it's data scraping, isn't it great? From CVs and all of this. Look at the patterns of the words we're using. And we haven't, and it goes, this is top notch, this is cutting edge. Look, thousands of years ago, I think first personality assessment is a zodiac, one item, when are you born, 12 types. And that's it. So before we looked at the stars to devolve patterns of your personality, though stars move over millennia, which is not factored in, to divulge your personality. And now we look at patterns within the words you use on Twitter and your CVs. So all it shows, humans like to use patterns and stimuli in order to deduct people's personalities. That's about it. Nothing changed. So I'm not sure if Zodiac actually incorporates changes of the stars across millennia. Check it out.
Yes, because Mercury used to be in a different orbit.
Yeah.
So you said, what else are you doing? Paired process, introducing aspirations, separating role from preference, and not mixing up all of this stuff of behavior, motivation, attitude, etc., in an undefined way with find me a manual that says, and we decided to have 20% motivation, 20% behavior. You don't get it. It's a hodgepodge. And I did neglect to give you one other influence on my thinking, which was Michael Schluter, who wrote The R Factor, and with whom I wrote The Relational Lens. And he's an economist. Finding how people outside our discipline of psychology has got something to contribute to our understanding of people. His lens was relationships. His lens was working in Kenya and saying, this is the underdeveloped world, but they're far richer than us in their interrelational, community building, all that. The poverty in just terms of wealth is not the right lens for all of this. And so he developed that in the R Factor, and then I helped him bring a bit more psychology, but we had a theologian helping us write it because, that's a really big influence on the human psyche. Him as an economist, me as a psychologist, and you've got the book, The Relational Lens, and how we as psychologists ought to be a little less focused on individualism, which is where psychometrics is, and a lot of psychology is, me, the individual, as a lot of recruitment is. We recruit an individual. We don't think of how that blends into the team enough about that. And it's not a Belbin thing. You need one of them, one of them, one of them, because that doesn't work. That often leads to conflict. So it's how you build those relationships, which is what the relational lens is about. But what Michael Schluter helped me to do was to lift my head from thinking I was helping individuals and small teams to saying there's a much bigger prize here, which is about how we change the focus of politics from who gets what to what is the value to human life and existence on this planet. And that's what we should be focusing on more. I do get fed up with the occupational psychologists who, as their mantra, say, I'm here to help you with your bottom line. Oh my goodness.
I want to make organizations more effective. I want to make sure they get most value from their employees. Oh my God. I became allergic to reading occupational psychology journals. And then I realized why. the only two kind of categories I use is either employee or a leader. And I never met a single person who says, hi, Nikita, I'm a leader, or hi, I'm an employee. And I'm just like, we work in this completely just weird, I don't know, even the vocabulary we use.
Well, it's captured in the summary of, you know, organizations see people as a method of getting profit, and we need to change it to profit being a way of making people more at home, whatever that is.
And this is why I always say when I'm qualifying, working with people with psychometrics, and it's like, how can we use this ethically? And I say, well, first step is look at the name. The psyche comes before the metrics. And depending on which Wikipedia you read, like psyche is the divine light of individual within, or the soul, you name it.
Yeah.
And as long as you put the interest of the individual first and foremost, whether it's an applicant, whether it's a colleague, whether it's, you name it, and then you look at the metric.
Yeah.
That's a good way, because I always say humans have a really poor track record when we start treating our fellow humans as numbers.
So, all right, Nikita.
Perfect. Thank you, Roy. But just as a quick plug, would you mind saying about your qualification? Because as far as I know, that most psychometric publishers just offer the level A or level 1 or level 2, and you offer a third level, which kind of...
It's been there for a long time, 15 years, 20 years. It used to be called level B full, when it was level B intermediate. It's now called specialist in test use. To do that, people need to have, or to get it as an official quality, you can do it, anybody can do it. You know, we don't mind. It's all online, but supported by Zoom meetings like this. But to get it as an official qualification, you need to have test user ability, test user personality, and have at least 2 instruments at old level B, okay? And they've got to be sufficiently different. So maybe a type and a trait, although sometimes a competency and, you know, NEO and an OPQ, according to the criteria, would be sufficiently different. I challenge that, but anyway. But at least 2 instruments, so they come with at least an idea that one instrument doesn't do it all. And then what we do is we go through what makes a good instrument. And basically, I think people who want to sell tests find the specialist in test use a little too challenging, because it would make you stand back and say, well, maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be, which is why they've all dropped it, I think, I guess. They don't do it, or because there's not much of a market. Not many people want to do it because it's hard work, but it's not, it's like a diploma level, but it's a practical thing in that people have to do a project about how they take a problem and solve it with some psychometrics, but in a bigger envelope. And so we do a lot of the check off of understood all the basic bits, and then they have to do a diary record and a project for it. And that is available.
Excellent. Well, and they can find it all, including the wonderful tools you have and the qualification on your website.
Yeah. Or by just, you know, email teamfocus@teamfocus.co.uk and we'll respond.
Nice. So Team Focus it is. Perfect. Thank you so much, Roy, for your time and your experiences and wisdom you have gained from working in the field. And I can't wait to see what sort of other interesting tools you're going to bring out or any books coming up.
Okay. All right, Nikita. Nice speaking to you.
See you soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.